Dan, I must admit, this seems very odd. I'm so used to being interviewed by you. Me getting the opportunity to interview you actually feels kind of strange.
I'm very eager to do it with you, Jemele, because if your audience does not know, there are very few people in the history of this business that I admire more than you. So thank you for just including me adjacent to anything you do, because I've been a fan of your work and your strength, because no one in our business has had to be stronger than you for 30 years.
Well, thank you for telling people how old I am, that I'm a fossil, but I appreciate you saying that. That means a lot. Coming from somebody like you whose career I feel like I have respected for just as long, if not longer, going back to your days at the Miami Herald, because a lot of people, they get so caught up in the television thing and all the multimedia things that you do now that there's an entire possible generation that is not familiar with Dan Le Batard, the writer, which I found to be just as compelling as Dan Le Batard, the TV personality. I could make an argument, a more compelling writer, but I'll save that for a conversation or a question that I want to have with you later on in this interview. But because we tend to always dive into heavy stuff, I'm going to actually start with something a little bit lighter for you. Tell me, who is the athlete that made you love sports?
The reason that question is so funny, you know what? The way I'm going to tell this story, instead of just telling you and having you be shocked, the name of the athlete is going to be at the end of this story, because it's a funny answer to the question if I just left it alone as the name. The thing that made me love sports is I come from an exile family, a political exile family, not immigrant. They left for political reasons to chase freedom. And it was a very small life that I did not know was small, filled with a lot of fear and not very much money. So when my father, the person working at a fiberglass plant, got the worst tickets that they gave at the office that no one else wanted, he took me to a football game. And when I walked in with him, and I tell this story all the time when people ask me sports memory type questions, I still remember the way that my hand felt small in his, because he's taking me through a concourse at a loud football stadium with a lot of people, and I've just never seen anything like it. It's like a kid going to Disney World from a small existence and then just feeling the energy of, what is this thing? And the reason that we were going there is because the Dolphins were playing a truly terrible football team, and I got to scream from the stands that we were going to squeeze the juice. So O.J. Simpson is the answer to your question of the first athlete that I ever loved. And after that, a lot of things changed.
That one didn't age particularly well, did it?
But it was the feeling, right?
Right.
Like you can imagine, and I don't know what your origin story is, but I did not know that I would love sports. I did not know that the connection point to my father would have sports in it more than any other, that my father emotionally is probably somewhere on the Asperger's scale. So I, spent my entire childhood trying to please a man who wasn't doing pleasure, and, that was all pleasure. Like everything that happened there was me, awe and discovery, a kid opening Christmas presents and not knowing yet that Santa Claus doesn't exist.
So it appears that the lightness of our conversation has lasted all of 30 seconds, because you mentioned your parents and you are the son of Cuban exiles. For a lot of people, they don't know quite what that means. So as best you can you explain to them what that means, being the son of them, and what their life was like? Like, give us the connective tissue there.
My parents, more than anything else, taught me one thing above all else. I'm fairly incompetent as an adult toddler fixing anything around the house. It's embarrassing to me that my wife has to do all the things, because the thing that I was taught in my household is, if you work in America, you get to freedom. If you work in America, you get to opportunity. So work becomes who you are because they're leaving a communist regime that at the ages of 15 and 16, they are leaving their parents, not knowing whether they'll ever see them again, and then not meeting up with them again for 10 years. So if the audience can imagine whatever that is of leaving your country to go to another country where you don't speak the language and don't have any money, and you think you're going to see your family again, but they're putting you on planes because they're worried about a revolution and the changing politics of Cuba that make it so that a tyrant and firing squads are coming to people who have different religious beliefs. There's not going to be freedom of any kind, and America is a place of real freedom. When I talk about some of this stuff, and I imagine we'll cover where it is that I bumped heads with the ESPN, when I talk about this stuff, I don't tell Americans, hey, I value freedom more than you. But when you have either fled to find freedom or had to fight to get freedom, it's more front of lobe than if you've had freedom all of your life and are now not understanding what it's like or what the consequences are of it being encroached upon. So being in exile is a huge part of my identity, even though my pain is all borrowed. I didn't have to make any of the sacrifices. Like, they made all the sacrifices. All I had to do was work, and I since become Americanized. My father named me Dan instead of Gonzalo or Luis because he didn't want me to endure any of the things that I would have to endure if I was Gonzalo or Luis. And the great irony of that is when I get a show on ESPN that is meant to cater to the underserved Hispanic population, I have to put my cartoon father on in his accent because no one knows Dan Le Batard is Cuban instead of French.
Now, how has that, would you say, like coming from that parentage and that background, how does that shape the way you look at American politics?
I mean, I'm so confused by what's happening in America right now, Jemele, because of how vastly I underestimated how much race is used as politics. And I don't know how much the audience understands either Florida or Cuban voting. There are only, I think, 1.5 million Cuban voters, but they vote Republican for, a thing that dates back to Bay of Pigs and also doesn't like that Barack Obama opened borders to a normalized relations with a Fidel Castro who represents my family's Hitler in Cuba, but Fidel did a lot to help black folks in Cuba, and it was part of his unpopularity in Cuba. And so it's a complicated mix of things that you have lived for a long time and see happening in front of us right now, where race becomes politics, even though, like, race should be about race, but we know what it is to other people. And so I've sort of meandered into, I have separated from the politics of my people here locally. They call me El Gusano, the worm in Spanish, because I don't align with my people here because I'm progressive. My people don't believe that Trump is a threat to democracy. They believe that the Democratic Party is the socialist party that wishes to not embrace, again, capitalism, work, keep your money, economy is the most important thing, and also Cubans have a different relationship with this country than, say, Haitians, because for the longest time, Cubans can get here on a boat. When you ask me my parents leaving at 15 or 16, Jemele, imagine what I'm about to say to you. The biggest graveyard that there is the ocean that separates Cuba from Miami. Imagine getting on a boat made of tires and wood to escape your desperation and literally throwing your life to the wind because you got to get the 90 miles to land in Florida because Cubans get freedom here, or used to, wet foot, dry foot, but Haitians do not. Or nobody else does, really. So that freedom is at the forefront of where it is that I separate from my people on politics locally, regionally here in Miami.
So when did that separation begin? Because you're growing up in a household that's very firmly connected to those politics, I would imagine. So how and when did you start to separate?
when I started meeting and talking to black people. When I was at the University of Miami, and one of my best friends is Bernard Clark, and he's saying to me, you know, there is justice in jail, right? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, it's just us. And like, that's the first time that I sort of started thinking about any of those things, because I didn't have any black people in my childhood. It was very Cuban. It was very isolated. You know how this stuff happens. Like, it's how communities get divided everywhere. Like, we grow up around our circumstances. And my father was hell-bent on sending me, even though we couldn't afford it. Like, he was driving a car. The glove compartment would open anytime we hit a bump, and there was a hole in the floorboard. But he was hell-bent on getting me to a private school, getting me an education that had money. And so it had money, but didn't have diversity. Not until I got to college and started making friends with the University of Miami football players that I was sort of like, it was a bit of culture shock, right? Seeing how this group of people who were my friends in college were being received by the country at large as I'm coming up in sports writing, and they're the most controversial thing that anyone has seen in sports, these guys who are running roughshod over sportsmanship.
So, I mean, having that sort of political education, socio-political education, do you feel like that made you perhaps best equipped, or at least somewhat equipped, to navigate these tricky waters of sports and politics?
Best equipped. I don't know if I've navigated it particularly well, Jemele, because I've never considered myself someone who's in any way interested in politics. I'm interested in race, and then as I grew up, it got turned into politics on me. I wasn't talking politics at ESPN. I was always talking about race. And then after George Floyd, it became sort of inevitable that, oh, we're not going to be able to pretend to keep separating these things. Like, you lived it. I saw you live it. At the end, I would throw an occasional Molotov cocktail, because one of the times I got in trouble at ESPN is because you can imagine, as an exile, where it is I would get pissed off that a president of this country, would be telling immigrants and exiles to go back to where they came from. Like, I don't need to explain to you how offensive it is to me that an American president would take that position. But until we got to that point, I wasn't somebody who was actively seeking to talk politics. I hate politics, and I hate it more now than ever, because it's gotten dumber than ever, when the way that we're discussing this is I'm sitting here holding up in front of you, hey, this is a pen, and the other side is telling me, no, it's a fork. And I'm like, okay, that's the set of facts that we're going to do this on. We're going to have that discussion. And so you can imagine how empty and stupid it's gotten now, where, like, it's not even a good faith discussion we're having. You don't actually care to discuss this. You just want to be right. And you want to keep telling me that as I strive for equality for everyone, instead of, me asking you for equality and feeling like that's a reasonable request, you're telling me at the height of white power, no, you can't have equality. I'm not going to give it to you. You're going to have to take it from me.
Well, part of it, too, is that we approach equality from a scarcity mindset. I'm not saying you and I do this, but I think that is very much how the vast majority of Americans feel about it. And that is something that colors kind of all races to some degree, because, I think one of the wedge issues that certainly happen in the black community is how they're trying to pit us against immigrants or pit us against migrants, right? And so it's this constant, well, if they get let in, then I get less. Or if they start taking advantage of some of these social services, that means less for me. So equality, the way that it's positioned in this country, is that if somebody else gets something, somebody else loses something. And that, to me, is at the root of why our politics are so toxic, particularly in this moment.
It's also a great strategy to keep things unequal. If you keep pitting different groups against each other, they won't get to the places where the power is, because they're distraction tactics meant to keep us apart. It's sort of it's like if you read history books, this is sort of how you do all of this stuff. It's a how-to book.
Do you sometimes, Dan, because I go through this, do you sometimes wish that you could be the guy that, and this is not to suggest in anybody who's listened to your show, know that you do actually talk about sports, right? I know some people probably, and you talk about a variety of things, right? Like in the entertainment space, like you're more than just the guy who's always talking about politics or race, like you're much broader than that. But are there times or moments or stretches where you wish you could wake up and just be the guy that argued about who's going to win the AFC East this year?
No, I got bored with that pretty early in the process, right? I love sports, but what I've always loved the most about sports is the sociology of sports. It's not the athletes, it's how did they become that? What are the roots of all of that? I can be moved by sporting events, but you know how this works. I don't know if you're the same sports fan now that you used to be, but if you work for 30 years making the McDonald's fries, they probably don't taste the same the last day as they did the first. So in growing up or trying to grow up, I've tried to have diverse interests beyond sports. And now I would say is just about because the political discourse has gotten so dumb and it's not about changing anyone's mind. It's about arguing and being right. Now is the first time that I have felt my hands heavy in the fight because it doesn't feel like we're doing anything in terms of advancing or making any progress on where it is that people are entrenched. And I'm like, and I'm so tired of losing listeners because all of this is so polarizing, like making choices that I have had to make and knowing that the cost is going to be somebody out there is going to think that all I do is talk about politics when all I'm trying to do is show people again and again, can you look at this? Like, look at what this looks like. Can we just be a society that when this does creep into sports, we remember Colin Kaepernick was simply asking people while kneeling in front of a flag super peacefully, can you stop being brutal to my people? And we wrap ourselves in that flag to give him the answer of, no, we can't stop being brutal to your people, and get the fuck out of the sport while you're at it.
Yeah, I mean, it is sometimes woefully and painfully confusing that we have, as much as we pretend we have learned from history, we have actually not learned anything from history. Because, like, that is just another reincarnation of, obviously, when you had, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, that is like another, and we've run into this iteration like 1,000 times, where it's like, how many times do we have to painfully learn a lesson historically to understand that this is not how things should actually work? But as you know, as somebody who dives deep into these waters of trying to navigate sports and political conversations, it comes at a cost. And you just alluded to it. You said you've had to make choices. What do you mean by that statement that you've had to make choices in terms of how you navigate this?
Sure. I don't know if the public at large has, and especially your audience, understands, because you've made it look so easy. I don't know that everyone totally understands how hard it was for you to leave ESPN. You and I haven't actually talked about this, but in creating our own media company and realizing and trying to hire some of my friends that none of them actually want to leave the safety of ESPN because it's a good place to be, that's much safer than the waters that I'm presently in, where I have the terrifying responsibility of 45 employees, and I've got to keep my numbers up in a way I've never cared about, because all I was interested in is doing the show correctly and hoping that people would stay with me. But you go free, and whether it is Dan Patrick did his show from his attic for a long time, and no one has any idea how actually hard that was, because he too made it look easy. This has not been in any way easy for me. I need to keep our customers. They feed the employees who now have kids that I knew when they were kids, and I'm now responsible for that. And so what is the cost when I have Billy Corbin do Because Miami, because he's on the side of every right thing here politically in Miami? but it's an unpopular thing. The cost is listeners. The cost is I'm done with Le Batard. He talks too much politics. When it's not even my show, I'm just supporting a show that is on our network because it's important to show just how woefully corrupt Miami is in ways that are inarguable. Like, it's not even, hey, we can agree to disagree on this. No, these are the set of facts on our entire government in Miami is a banana republic that is more corrupt than probably any in the United States. And with journalism dying, Jemele, like dying in a way that has that orange oaf fucking taking a hatchet to it with something as simple as fake news, because so many people don't know what the difference is between the New York Times, Bleacher Report, and just somebody writing something on a QAnon website. Like, there's no difference in credibility between those things. And some of those people believe the New York Times is less credible because of the damage we've done to mainstream media. I think it's important to protect those things because front of lobe for me is always freedom, and I recognize that journalism is a checks and balances for government when you've got presently, Jemele, and this part's crazy to me, I don't know how Donald Trump sleeps at night because of the following. He's in the middle of right now, you win and knock over democracy, or you die in prison. Those are your two choices because you want to change all the rules on how all of this works. You want to gerrymander and put federal judges in and have the Supreme Court be bought so that you can be in charge to stay out of prison. And I want a journalism that is checks and balances to that, and it's being threatened. And so now I have to pay Billy Corbin to please do this for me so that my show can have a soul during an important time.
Yeah, we're going to get to the journalism part because I don't know if you realize this or even if you like this role, but you have sort of become sports media, sports journalism. Let me be very clear. There is a difference between sports media and sports journalism. You have become sports journalism's sort of unofficial ombudsman in many respects with how I think a lot of your criticisms of our industry are not just fair, I think they're scarily accurate. But before we get to that part, let's get to the part that you were just mentioning about leaving ESPN and what that looks like and making it look easy. You know, a lot of people don't know that, like, or would not imagine somebody like you or maybe even somebody like me. We never got in this to be entrepreneurs. Like, I did not get in this to own a company, or in my case, companies. I did not get in this to do that. In fact, I found the idea totally repulsive because, you know, as journalists, you're sort of used to operating as an independent force, doing your own thing. And then all of a sudden, through different scenarios and different events, you become responsible for others. And as exciting as that is on some regard, or at least the idea of bringing people with you and making sure that their lives are in a place, you know, where they can take care of their families and that kind of thing. But it does come with a draining emotional responsibility. I'll be the first to admit I've not always handled that responsibility well. So what I want to ask you is, how have you been able to find your way in these tricky entrepreneurial waters where now you're responsible for other people, and people don't get that that's a different responsibility? Like, you can hate me all you want, but unfortunately that does come at a cost. That means that, like, if I lose people, I can't pay this person what I want to pay them. It is just such a sometimes terrible balancing act. So how have you managed, or how do you manage to deal with that?
Poorly.
That's about the best answer I have too.
I mean, I just keep falling on my face and try to convince myself that failure is learning, and I tend to be pretty hard on myself, so failure feels like failure. But I, like you, didn't have any interest in entrepreneur. I was a bit forced into it, right? You let go my mentor's son without telling me as a final act of, trying to make my life more difficult. And you hurt me in a way that I have to make a choice about what I do next, even though I would have stayed in the safety of ESPN for a long time.
And you're referring to Chris Cody, correct?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So Greg Cody is one of my best friends in the world, and ESPN, it was a final straw because we were running up against this for a while. and I was looking for an exit ramp, and they gave it to me when they fired or they let him go without telling me. And so we had to make a choice, and they pushed me into something I wouldn't have chosen otherwise. You know my wife, Valerie. I couldn't have done this without her either. And so I get pushed into entrepreneurship when I'm telling you, Jemele, zero interest in it. I was very happy having my professional life only be something that I had to worry about me, and then a company would take care of my company, the people who kept me company. Somebody else would take the burden of paying those people. But yeah, there's just been a lot of struggling, a lot of learning, and thankfully we're in a time where we've got one of the 5 or 10 things in this space that someone's willing to pay a lot of money for, DraftKings, so that we can keep doing it, which to me is honestly the measure of success. Do I get to keep doing it? That is, I don't want any of the other stuff. Do I get to keep fucking around with my friends, having fun around this, and us having a thing that makes people happy or smile, and more than that, because we're a fairly addictive cotton candy for people, help some people who are lonely at bad jobs or jobs that they hate get a little bit of medicine that for 4 of the 8 hours they could listen to what it is that we're doing and be slightly less alone.
I'm not going to ask this next question because I've sensed the answer, but mostly because I know the enormous responsibility and enormous effort that it takes to do what you do. But how much longer do you think you can do this?
On the days that I'm happy, they're going to have to put me in this seat 10 years after my death to get people to still keep paying for whatever our show is in its remains. But on the days where I'm unhappy, and there have been more of those over the last, I'm not even going to say 3.5 years, my last 18 months at ESPN, as soon as Skipper left, basically, as soon as the CEO of Meadowlark left ESPN, the world fell in on me. I lost what I didn't know was protection, because I just wanted him to leave me alone and I would leave him alone. And the whole way I ended up at ESPN, I won't bore you with too many of the details, but I was CAA's worst client for 10 years because I insisted on doing it in Miami. Everybody wanted me to do it in Los Angeles and New York. The answer was always no. Can you make something more Miami than the Miami thing I have? And Skipper had to get the Latin demo. Just like you were the only black woman columnist in America for God knows how long, I was the only name that kept coming to him on Hispanic journalist. How do you make ESPN a little more ethnic, more diverse? They're in Bristol, Connecticut. Old thinking, white thinking, how do you do it? I was the name that kept coming up for him, and the way that he made it more Miami is like, I'll hire your father, your brother can do the art, the ocean will be behind you at the Clevelander Hotel, and that's when I went to work for ESPN, because he wanted to have, he had learned that, and I think you were one of these people, he had learned that he couldn't change the thousands of people at ESPN, so he was going to hire 10 fire starters to just see where it is that people would get influenced on stuff. And what ended up happening is all the fire starters had to run from the burning building because they wanted us out of there eventually. As soon as
the arsonists won. They won. They did. Right?
Right? Like that's, I think if we're the fire starters, that means at the end the arsonists lose because they kicked us out of the building, and Disney says to itself, we don't want any more fires. Like, we don't want fires. We just want warmth and SEC football. Get out of here.
You're right. I said that wrong. The water won, not the fire. Right. Yeah, which was, Skipper shared that philosophy with me, and I was, on one hand, exhilarated to be among the chosen fire starters, if you will. But on the other hand, I was thinking to myself, maybe he underestimated the power of my fire, because I am up against something that, like, I can't change culture that way. Like, at least you got to change the culture in Miami, or not in Miami, but from Miami.
Well, that's a big difference,
That's a big difference to being
it's a huge,
Yes.
huge distinction that you're making, because I was able to work outside of the bubble and I had the great freedom of being anti-establishment while inside of ESPN's establishment. But I don't know how much we actually influenced anything. Like, there were a lot of hugely smart people that wanted to be at our side, you among them, because you're like, what do they get to do down there, right? So it's Dominique Foxworth, it's Bomani Jones, it's Mina Kimes, it's Pablo Torre. It's some of the smartest journalists at the company are like, wait a minute, I want to go down there and do the playground thing that they're doing. Sarah Spain, Katie Nolan, like Izzy Gutierrez, like, and they were all, this, all the people who sat next to my father on Highly Questionable, all of them were minorities or women. Like, that's all that ever sat next to my father. That was both a point of pride and hugely important to me, because it was the job I was hired to do until Skipper left. And then it was very much not the job that they wanted me doing anymore.
Yeah, and I've joked with you about this off air, and to this day, as much as I loved Highly Questionable, I still, part of me wants to kill you, because my mother to this day still asks me why we can't do a show together because of your ass. And I'm like, just because you saw Dan do it, and you left me no choice but to make continual excuses. I'm like, you're not Poppy, but that's okay.
It is one, I mean, it's obviously the greatest professional blessing I've ever had, but it's the biggest miracle I ever pulled off professionally, Jemele. The idea that my father, who doesn't know that much about sports and was trying to do the show in his second language, would steal the stardom from me on my own show. But Jemele, on a show that has me and Bomani Jones on it, you're telling me my father's going to be the star? It's actually an interest. Formulaically, it's Bomani used to say this all the time. He says, if the thing they're saying about your show, it's that it's a smart show or the smartest show, you don't have a successful show. It's got to have the range. So the idea that my father was able to be the softener that wouldn't turn me and Bomani into the world's most strident, obnoxious things, giving you opinions on race and politics that maybe you didn't want to hear. It's one of the biggest magic tricks that I'm proudest of, that my father was able to do all of that. I can't tell you how grateful I am about it, because the other thing about it is, Jemele, like, when I try to explain the stickiness of my father to people, I've covered Udonis Haslem since he was in high school, and the most I've ever seen him, like, visibly radiant, happy, and laughing is leaning on my father, laughing, being held up because my father is doing some collaborative rap with Migos or something that they're watching together. And my father, I'm not going to say he's an icon in the black community, but I don't think many people like, I do not think that there is a group of people that my father has a demo that my father has a better Q rating with, not even Cubans, than black men who love my father. Second place might be women who loved watching sort of a sitcom dad and an adult have a father-son relationship on television. But I think first place, and I never really totally understood that either, Jemele. Like, I didn't know whether, is this my father's the guy at the barber shop? Is this just liking a father figure on television? I never totally understood how and where that connection happened, even after doing the show for 8 years.
Yeah, the young folks that might be listening to this particular episode, excuse me for using a term that is very outdated, but I think it applies in this case to your father. Your father just had kind of natural swag, like, to be honest. And because of that, and we never often think of our parents that way because they are our parents. So, but to other people, at least certainly me as an outsider watching your show, it was just his vibe. Like, he passed every vibe check. And I'm sure you've heard, of course, black people talk about who's invited to the cookout, but realize that within that, your stature at the cookout is related to the level of responsibility that you have as it relates to the cookout. So, like, Dan, we would let you maybe bring the red Solo cups to the cookout, right? Your dad might be able to bring an actual dish that we would eat to the cookout. That's the difference. That's the difference, with all due respect to you.
Well, first of all, your with all due respect is a really poorly constructed crutch for something that is not respect. It diminishes It diminishes the entirety of my career that my invitation is so flimsy, and you know good and well that the only reason I get to come with the solo cups is because people want to see my dad, right? Because people want my dad's dish. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be invited to the cookout.
So on the hierarchy of cookout, that's where you stand. As I mentioned earlier in our conversation, Dan, whether intended or unintended, I have a feeling sort of unintended, you have become like the ombudsman of our profession. And for those who are not familiar with what that is, we, believe it or not, in media, in newspapers in particular, that's where I think that position originated with. It was somebody's job to sort of keep the newspaper or the media outlet in some cases, because ESPN had an ombudsman a couple of times, right? Is that your job was to sort of take a lens to that entity that you were working for, and in fairness and the point of accuracy, sort of cover them the way they cover other people. Like when something went wrong at the newspaper where they mishandled something, it was the ombudsman's job to sort of deliver to the public. They were operating on the behalf of the public, of being the checks and balances for the newspaper. And it was a public position. Again, as I mentioned, ESPN used to have this position for ESPN.com and generally things that happen at the network. And Dan, you sort of have become the person in that role when it comes to telling people the things that are good and are bad about our industry, and many of which I think are unlike anything both of us have probably seen in our career, particularly as we're in this space now. Now, you said journalism is dying. I hate to be this pessimistic. I think we have lost that fight. And I know that's probably a terrible thing to say when you're still in it, but there's just so much now that is not just foreign, but sort of unacceptable with the way that we cover things, both in sports and politics and all the things that sort of matter to our American culture. You said is dying, as in like we're still in process of. Do you feel like we still are waging a fight, or do you feel as if the fight has been lost?
Fair enough, your correction. You are right, I am wrong. I've told people 9 or 10 years ago who care about journalism the way I do, hey, we've lost, it's over. Like it was a long time ago that I said that we have lost. But the ombudsman role that I took at ESPN, and thank you for being discerning enough to notice it, because I don't know how many people would say that about me. But it was something. One of the criticisms I get all the time is, oh, look at Le Batard, so bitter now after he's left the place, criticizing the place. And I'm like, I thought that was my job while I was still there. Like some of the biggest fights that I had at ESPN with executives was trying to explain to them how much more credibility we would all have if we covered the worldwide leader in sports the way the worldwide leader in sports covers athletes. But anytime they had a problem there, it was hide it in the shadows. And I'm like, no, if you let me talk about it and explain, here's where the company was wrong. If you trust me to be someone who's going to have a journalistic integrity, you'll make all of us stronger by allowing me to be someone who's critical of the place in a way that's meant in no way to be I shouldn't say in no way to be self-serving, because of course it's going to help my credibility and make me seem more dangerous if I'm the person willing to criticize the man the way David Letterman would criticize his network employer, or John Oliver does it now. Like, of course, you elevate everyone when you give a journalist that freedom. But I did feel, and you could speak to this better than I can, because maybe I don't have an appraisal that's accurate here, or maybe there's too much ego in it. I did feel like I kind of earned it, and I did feel like there aren't a whole lot of people there journalistically who would argue with much of any of what I was generally saying. They just didn't want out in public. Think about what I'm saying here, Jemele. The worldwide leader in sports covers everyone with a microscope that is scalding, like scalding. Anyone, an athlete, steps in a pothole, and we are there to cover it with a great deal of intensity. Why, when the thing comes your way, and again, you're the worldwide leader in sports, why would you go hide under a blanket? Like, you're a really powerful entity. You got all of Disney's fuck you money. You can do the job however it is that you want to do it. What's the point of having all the world's fuck you money and never telling anybody fuck you?
Yeah, and ESPN, as you know, never saw it this way. Because I think that's a way to actually gain credibility with the audience, when you are willing to say, or at least when your personalities are allowed to say, hey, this is where ESPN got it wrong. And as you said, kind of look at them, even though we're, at that point, we're all getting our paychecks from them. But I think the audience respects you more when you don't treat them like they're stupid. Like, they can see it, okay? They can see what is happening, and we're pretending like this is not happening. And to me, that's losing credibility with the audience.
But Jemele, the thing that you have such a unique vantage point on, that perhaps because it's been a generation ago, many people don't even remember it, ESPN kept getting more and more credibility because in the Sports Century series, they would sit down journalists who would tell stories and then have these documentaries that had all of this richness because the journalists had all the stories. It would be me and Mitch Albom and Mike Lupica doing the essays on television that were meant to be journalistic. Then when PTI and Around the Horn come, they are literally trafficking in the names of newspapers because Skipper wants this to be a coast-to-coast company that has Chicago Tribune newsroom behind it, Denver Post newsroom, LA Times newsroom. So you're trafficking in the credibility of newspapers while taking the columnists who are supposed to be watchdogs and giving them all of the television cotton candy that ends up ending those newspapers because everyone runs to the money of television. And now your watchdogs can't actually say anything honest. They're not watchdogging anymore. They're collecting the paychecks as we slowly burn up the credibility. ESPN grabs the parts that it wants and discards the parts that it doesn't and becomes a journalism company that never had to be a journalism company. Like, they didn't have to choose that. There's not a J in ESPN. It's entertainment and sports. There's not a journalism in there. They chose it, and now they fairly obviously are getting out of that business in a way that shakes and rattles the entire industry because it's super interesting the way it's happening.
Yeah, and that's the part that I fear, is that when you look across our landscape, not only is ESPN, they have obviously being the worldwide leader, them getting out of the journalism industry or the journalism part of it. And some journalism still goes on there. But the reality is, like, Outside the Lines is a shell of itself. E60 doesn't largely exist anymore. And you look at how Real Sports is not there anymore. Like, these sports investigative, long-form, sink your teeth in type of journalism is just absolutely obliterated at this point in our industry. And I fear about how that is going to maintain a level of, or a complete lack of transparency, particularly by these behemoth leagues and places. Like, they already got away with a lot. They're going to get away with monstrous things because there's nobody keeping their eye on the store, because as an industry, we've just decided that just isn't profitable anymore. So with that being said, though, Dan, given that we both have been able to attain a level of fame and money through the very thing that is killing our business, how do you sort of resign or look at your place in the industry now, given that it's changed so dramatically from where your career started and even at the midpoint in your career?
Just because you're losing the fight or even know that you're going into the fight and you're going to lose it doesn't mean that it's not a fight worth fighting. And I would say to you that wherever it is that the most ardent loyalty exists in our audience, and I will tell the people listening to this, it's Le Batard and Friends on YouTube. We are now on Peacock. We are now on Max. We have built something that has an audience that travels with us, at least because many of those people do value that. They value that I am and we are something that is trying to stand for something, even if it might be a losing fight. You're not going to stop fighting for racial equality, even as the fight gets dumber and dumber. You're not going to stop fighting for it, even though you witnessed what I witnessed, which was after George Floyd, all of those same corporations. It seemed like a genuine movement. I was tricked by it. Like, I thought there might be actual change here.
Oh, Dan,
I know.
Naive soul.
Well, but yeah, right. I thought that it felt good enough to hope, and yes, I am naive. I can be a fool. But corporations reverting back to the hedge fund safety of all we have to do is profit is what makes it appalling to me in a way that I don't even think people notice, Jemele. Jon Stewart, the history of this is such that whatever the television anchorman used to be in your wartime times in a different America, Jon Stewart became, by polling, the most credible journalist in America for about 10 years as a comedian, simply because he was doing journalism a little bit differently, and he became a trusted newsman. Polling said he's your most trusted newsman. To have that guy go to Apple and do a legitimately great, difficult show when Apple doesn't have to worry about anyone, and Apple keeps choosing safety instead of employing someone who does good work because they have relationships with China and everything else, for them to run off Jon Stewart and not be able to support something that feels like it's on the right side of history is excellent, is meticulous, is something that should make any entity proud. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing when the journalists who keep us safe on the right fights are so distrusted by everyone that even the giant businesses that don't need your money because they make adapters every week that fail in a year so they can sell you more adapters? And my phone has so many Apple charges, Jemele, that I have no idea what I'm being charged for. They can charge me for anything, and it's like, yeah, that's a good cost, and they're doing that to everybody. For them not to be able to support what's right? Like, come on. What are we doing?
Well, as you know, there are a lot of people who think a lot differently. And one of the people who thinks a little bit differently is your friend and someone I have known also for a long time in Stephen A. Smith, right, who has become the face of ESPN, firmly in the conversation of maybe most successful journalist ever, given what the empire he's been able to build around himself. You and him had a wonderful conversation on his show, the Stephen A. Smith Show, his podcast, which is on YouTube. And I found this part to be hilarious, and I love the sense in which you took it. So I'm going to play this clip right now, because I don't think I've ever heard someone take these particular kind of insults as well as you took them. So everybody take a listen.
You've got your flavor, other people have theirs. What's the problem? You do seem to be a bit sanctimonious, man. I'm not going to use the word hypocritical because I think that's harsh, and I don't think you deserve that, especially from your buddy who is me. But sanctimonious, I just got off the phone with my man Mike Wilbon. He's listening right now. I told him a few minutes, and he was like this. We both love Dan. We love him. He's our brother. But you tell his sanctimonious ass to calm down. That is a quote from Mike Wilbon. And I would echo that quote, Dan. Sanctimonious, yes.
Jemele, he's a really good arguer. He is very good at debate, and I think it's fair to accuse me of being so strident in tone sometimes that I get in the way of my message because of my conviction that I am absolutely right on something. So it's a criticism, I think, that is fair of me, that perception. I can only argue against it so much because I understand how Stephen A. Smith would think that he and I are doing the same thing when I don't think we're doing the same thing. But he's like, why are you better than me? Because I do debate television for the lowest common denominator that casts a wide net, and I tell you publicly that my main goal, or one of my chief goals, is to make money for my bosses, that I am in the business of making money for my bosses. He's a good businessman, and that is a prudent model. And his story at ESPN is unlike any in the history of the media business. To be fired and make it all the way back,
and not just all the way back, become the face of the entire company.
Right, yeah. And so that is a good way to do it. And I will appear sanctimonious and self-righteous if I tell you that's not what I chose. I chose to be a niche thing that wouldn't be that kind of that wouldn't be what he is. And see, I don't want to say he's a company man because he's a company man. Mm-hmm. Like I can't believe what he has built, but he'll also tell you at every turn that he lives in service of making his bosses money, and that's just not what I do. And if he were to take that as criticism, that I'm being self-righteous and sanctimonious as if I'm better than him, I understand how he would arrive at that position, even though I don't think I'm better than him. And in fact, I would say at television, he's a good deal better than me.
Yeah, and I think probably your lived experience very much shapes how you look at things. And, for those people who don't know, but Stephen A was let go by ESPN, right? He was persona non grata. Like when I got to ESPN, quite frankly, his show that he used to have was still going. And then when all of that kind of dissipated and he was off the network, it was a very frosty time. And so the media business wasn't where it is now, where you can kind of be independent. And while there is some struggle to it, the thought of not being at ESPN is not crazy anymore. Like when Dan Patrick left, people thought he was insane for leaving ESPN. And so when Stephen A, when their relationship disintegrated, it put him in like a no man's land and it took a big fight and a lot of clawing for him to get back on the network. So I think he probably looks at the experience much differently because he saw a cold life without ESPN.
Oh, and Jemele, he's a black dude.
Yeah, it's
just
different.
all harder for him.
Yes.
No, it's just
It's gonna be
all
different.
of it would be much harder for him. Like I am in awe that Stephen A. Smith, after being fired by ESPN, has absolutely unequivocally become the modern day Howard Cosell. I cannot believe the degree of difficulty on that as a fired black man with a failed show on that network. I can't help but be awed by that because he played the game flawlessly to get the things that he wanted. And the degree of difficulty on that, you'd be in the rare position of being able to understand how that is as a black woman. In fact, Stephen A. and I have had these conversations, and I'm not betraying any confidences when I say so. Like in an assortment of fights and conflicts that I had at ESPN, where, by the way, he's the only one telling me, calling me up and saying to me, Dan, you can't go against the company publicly there. You can't do what you're doing on that one. I can't help but be amazed at what it is that he has made there of himself around so many obstacles, because you can speak uniquely. What he has said to me a number of times, Dan, you're not black. Like you can do that. You can do X, Y, and Z. I cannot do that. When I'm yelling about bosses and stuff, when I'm yelling about this person's incompetent, is this person evil or just incompetent? He's like, you can do whatever it is that you're doing there. I can't and won't do that. I have a responsibility to other black journalists. I have a responsibility to the black platform. I have a responsibility to black employees at ESPN. I can't do the things that you're doing there. That's your mess to make, not mine.
Now, I was of the opinion, I think you shared that during this interview, that Stephen A. was probably the person who had the most freedom to say what he wants to say, until Pat McAfee came along, when I realized clearly my idea of freedom was greatly distorted, because Pat McAfee has disrupted the system of how they do things at ESPN in a way that I'm frankly stunned by, repeatedly stunned. Of course, we know some of...
how naive. How the naive tables have turned on how shirtless white man in cowboy hat might have. How interesting how naive you are.
You're right. I mean, I just never thought that was possible, even for a white man. I got to be honest, because and perhaps I actually underestimated whiteness, and that's wild, because I'm a black woman that's lived in this country for their entire lives, and I underestimated whiteness and how that works. But I've seen Pat McAfee do something that I just never thought I would ever see at ESPN, and many of his transgressions, if you want to put him that way, well documented. He flamed our old boss Norby Williamson. He got him about to paint in a way that I was like, oh my God.
Hold on. Please, if I may just correct you a little bit there. That was never my old boss.
Oh, you're
okay?
right.
Please,
You're right.
Please be clear. Well,
you're right. It wasn't.
Please be clear on that. I mean, he was there. I'm not saying,
but
I'm not saying, no, but I'm also not saying he didn't have the power to be my boss. I am simply correcting you on that person was never going to be my boss. Never mind. Even if he was my boss in what direct reports are, that person was
never-
never going to be my boss. No, like, no.
Well, I
no.
did not avoid that. I was unsuccessful at avoiding that, but that's what happens when you're a part of Sports Center. So that person was my boss. And again, as I said at the time, ditto Pat McAfee, ditto, right? But even beyond all that, with some of the things he said and done, and most recently, he laughed at the idea of actually having to practice journalism at ESPN, even though we see how his show is platformed. But what I guess the rambling question I'm getting to is, what do you make of the Pat McAfee effect at ESPN?
Oh, so super interesting. I could talk about this with you for a long time because this is my business and I care about this business. And I'm guessing we're already going to get aggregated in some way, given how politicized both you and I are on whatever it is that it sounded like moments ago, where it may have seemed like we are saying just flatly that Pat McAfee gets away with all of that, or may be perceived because of whiteness. It isn't just
because of
that.
No,
it is absolutely not. I mean, he's wildly entertaining. He serves a young demo, and he comes in kicking the door down at a time, and this part is breathtaking, where ESPN needs him more than he needs ESPN, because all of the walls have crashed in on ESPN is renting his show, paying him a ton of money so he could give millions of dollars to Aaron Rodgers and Bill Belichick, and it's on their tab to grow his show because they don't know how to get young audience. And he's wildly charismatic, and he has, wrestling skills that make him counterculture in a way that people who are tired of journalism might want something different at ESPN that is pro-athlete. And I have just watched in genuine interest, right? Like, I'm just wildly interested on, hey, does everyone else see what's happening here and how awesome and amazing it is that it's so different from the way ESPN has done this in the past? Keep in mind, Jemele, Dan Patrick tells the story, and it's an amazing one. And you know this, and you and I have talked about some of this about ESPN. The way leadership worked there is just don't set any precedents for anybody on anything, so no one else can say, well, he or she got that, so can I have that. The beginning of the end for me at ESPN, I don't think anybody knows this, is actually that I got a T-shirt company in negotiations. I got a merch company in my last negotiations, and Disney wasn't really happy with the idea that I can make my own cartoons. Not surprisingly, Disney pretty proprietary about those things. So the precedent had been set that now anybody there can ask for things like that. But the famous story I tell is Dan Patrick is with Keith Olbermann on a culturally groundbreaking show that was the most powerful thing of its time. And Dan Patrick wanted a television in his office, so before going on SportsCenter, he could simply see what was happening in sports pre-internet. And the answer was no, because then Keith Olbermann would also want one. So if that's their system of governance since the beginning of time, imagine my shock when someone's getting drunk on 30 Guinnesses and telling all the smoke that he's got all sorts of drugs in his system because he's like, I don't care, I'm having fun. It's part of his appeal, and it's something that Disney signed up for in a way that breaks all precedents. And I obviously welcome all the anarchists who change the game, because what ends up happening with anything I say when I point this stuff out to people, like, hey, they told me this was coming. They told me that whatever I was doing, that they wanted more SEC football, that their customers want, and they're entitled to run their business the way they want. They don't have to make it about journalism. So they choose this guy who's not about journalism, and they allow him to urinate all over journalism, and it only makes him more popular, while it's kind of the opposite of what it is that we came up in back when ESPN needed the name Chicago Tribune in a newsroom, because that's what they were going for back then.
Yeah, and I want people to understand, because you're right, and I know how headlines work, is that there will be a headline that says, Dan Le Batard and Jemele Hill says Pat McAfee's only successful because he's white. Like, no, I am not saying that at all. Like, he's successful for all the reasons that you mentioned that have nothing to do with his whiteness. However, what I will say is that I do think that his behavior, and I'm not saying that in a wagging the finger kind of way, is more palatable because of who he is, because he is a youngish white man that is specifically has a audience that is also youngish, and there are certain things that he can do that frankly I don't know that a black person in his position would be able to do those things on that network. And that's not to say that that's in any ways his fault, but like, listen, I remember when Mike and I had his and hers, and we did a Boys in the Hood skit, which called for, you know, Ice Cube to be drinking a 40 ounce, right? Like it's the infamous scene where him and Cuba Gooding, it's toward the end of the movie, and he's just lamenting about all the violence in his neighborhood, and we basically recreated that scene. And I told one of the production assistants, go get me a real 40 ounce. And they were just like, we can't possibly do that. Like, we can't have you drinking a 40 on air. And I was like, in order for me to sell it, this has got to be a real 40. And I just wanted to sort of test the boundaries. And the conversations around that 40 ounce were just nauseating, right? They're just soul killing. It just sucks all the creativity out of you. We got it done. I tell people all the time, real 40 ounce, yes, I drank it. I'm pretty sure I'll go down in history, although maybe not so much because McAfee is there, as the only person in ESPN history to drink an actual 40 ounce of beer on air. I'm very proud of this. But I guess what ultimately, why I also am as equally fascinated by the effect of this, it's not about Pat McAfee being the first, it's about who will be the second. Will there be a second? Is this an experiment that they will be willing to try over and over again? And I don't know that will be the case. I don't know that they're going to, somebody who doesn't look like Pat McAfee, they're going to welcome them saying, yes, I take edibles. Yes, I do all this stuff. Yeah, I'm high. Yeah, I'm drunk. Yeah, I don't care about my bosses. Fuck everybody. Like, I don't know if them or many media companies are in the position to extend that to people who only look one way. And I don't know if I'm being wrong about that or whatever, but that's just my sense.
I think that they're already doing it, and McAfee will be the pioneer or the trendsetter here, and we will see what Shannon Sharpe and Stephen A. Smith get to do with the same power, and I don't know whether they have the same lack of fear. They don't seem to run their lives quite the same way that McAfee does, right. But we will see how the rules are or aren't different if they get into any of these things, and then we'll have all the arguments around that. I did hear, I heard Shannon the other day, because he's on the same path of owning his own stuff and being a brand so powerful that he doesn't have to actually respect quote unquote bosses at ESPN. Right. They report to Iger and Pitaro. That's the CEO of Disney and the president of ESPN. And I'm putting report in quote marks because I don't think that Shannon Sharpe actually has to listen to much of anybody anymore, because he's got his own thing, and he also doesn't need ESPN. ESPN needs him. Like, that's the seismic shift, right? That's always been a production company. The dirty secret about ESPN, I say this on my show all the time, nobody notices this, but you do realize that all of us on all the other shows are just the infomercials to get you to the games, right? Like, these shows don't have to be any good. They don't have to be any popular. They don't even have to do numbers, really. Like, whatever First Take does is between, 500,000 and 1 million in numbers. And at the height of ESPN, they had 120 million subscribers. So 119 million of them weren't watching First Take, and were paying anyway to not watch First Take. So all of the shows are just infomercials, and they can do whatever they want with the shows. I know Roy Wood Jr. tells me that in comedy he keeps an eye on sports television because it's just so cheap. You can make it so much more cheaply, 2 hours of television, because it's just people talking, that all of this stuff is actually, there's not a lot of incentive to make any of it any good, because just get them to the games, and now they have a little more pressure because of streaming has taken so many of their built-in advantages, right? It's not 120 million people anymore who are paying for this and not watching it. It's whatever it is, 60 million, 70 million, because people are off the grid. Streaming is eating up some of the numbers, and they now have to they have to get different audiences in the tent. What is Shannon Sharp's audience? Hey, come over here. I want you to watch Shannon on our thing. So what do you think? Like, I think Shannon Sharp can get away with a good deal, because when I saw him interviewed the other day, there are a lot of reports about McAfee and Stephen A. are fighting, or discord on the set of First Take. And Shannon Sharp's like, what discord can there be with me? I show up, I sit in a closet. I don't do any production meetings. I don't talk to any producers. Right. I don't talk to any vice presidents. I deal with whatever it is, 3 or 4 people at the company. Don't put me in your discord. I don't talk to anybody. And he doesn't have to. Imagine us trying to do the job that way. This is what they've welcomed in the door. And here's the funny thing about it, Jemele, and interesting to you, I imagine. These athletes have so much more confidence than the journalists do. So, like, so many athletes I've talked to at ESPN who look at me and just in general, the hair business and vanity business that is television, after a lifetime of being coached, and they say, why are you guys so insecure? Like, we're used to criticism. We're used to, corrections, coaching. And so I just think that Shannon Sharp and Pat McAfee and people like them, with their own brand and their own power and a lack of fear, can actually come in and be totally unafraid of bosses, because they're just producers. It's just a production company, and it's been making infomercials for a long time, with those producers just trying to hold on desperately to the power that now McAfee knocks out of their hands and Shannon Sharp knocks out of their hands, because, like, no, I'm going to go talk to Iger. I don't need to listen to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of leverage, is that when you can come in and leverage an audience into ESPN, because they're so used to, for a long time, as you know, the formula at ESPN was to build stars, right? And that was how they were able to, I think,
interchangeable, disposable stars, right? Like, nothing was bigger than the letters. Correct. Like, I mean, the first conversation I had with anybody at ESPN after Skipper had hired me, basically against everybody's will. Like, it wasn't something he was asking for permission on. An executive flies down here, some important vice president person flies down to tell me over the course of the meal how important, again and again, the brand is. And all I kept telling him again and again is, I don't care about your brand. Like, I just, like, you can keep telling me about it, but I'm so you know what you're getting here. I'm telling you, I'm not working for this brand. I'm working for this man. I never wanted to work for this company, because I have a pretty good idea of what Disney is, and no thank you.
Mm-hmm. But see, Dan, that was your leverage, though, because the leverage was that you were not so thirsty to be at ESPN. As you mentioned, your condition was, I'm staying in Miami. Y'all can take it or leave it. And that, to me, it's almost like in dating scenarios where it's like, men being sort of, if we're going by tropes and a little bit by stereotypes, men being natural hunters, if you will, they need to chase. And because you made ESPN chase you, you came in with a different amount of leverage than I did. Because when I got there in 2006, I came from newspapers, which they kept saying then the business is going downward. It's, they are not meeting the business demands. Like, advertising's down. Like, the business was contracting then. So jumping to ESPN was a huge move for me. That's not to say it wasn't huge for you, but I came in on like an independent contractor deal that was shitty. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how I got in there and had to kind of make my way up. But I think because you had your sense of worth already deeply implanted in you, it allowed you to have that same amount of leverage to where they had to meet you on your terms versus the other way around.
I didn't realize that, Jemele. You're the one who actually physically showed me something that I did not know about how much freedom I had being in Miami by simply being outside the bubble. Because I remember, I think I went to ESPN one time, to Bristol, Connecticut, one time in the 20 years that I worked there. And when it might have been 2 times, I can't remember, but when I walked in through ESPN and I saw you and Michael Smith, and I saw what I'm looking at as my peers. You are my peers. You are every bit the journalist and thing that I am. And I'm watching you, and you are at the tiniest cubicles doing I was like, oh my God. Oh my God. Like, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. Like, you didn't even have an office. Like, the two of you.
An office?
The,
Damn, that's a good one.
but no, so imagine my culture shock, right? I've got a studio in a bar in Miami, and outside I've got topless women on stilts wearing just like body paint, and that's what I'm working with. And I come in and I'm like, okay, so wait a minute, the most talented female black journalist of my lifetime gets a cubicle? They've got this woman working like this with Michael Smith, who's like a genuine prodigy in our business, who is getting things younger than I got them, and I got plenty of things young, and I'm looking at this guy. I looked at you two as peers, and I'm like, okay, is this happening because I'm Bristol, or is this happening because they're black? Like, what's happening here? What is this that I'm looking at?
No, well, and I will say, and I'm glad you told me the story. Thanks to Dan Patrick, you know what we had in those cubicles? Televisions. Thank you, Dan Patrick. I appreciate that.
Congratulations.
Thank
Progress.
You, Progress.
Civil rights. Civil rights led by Dan Patrick. Yes. Libertad. Libertad.
He led us to freedom. Our own ESPN Harriet Tubman. Thank you, Dan Patrick. Well, Dan, I want to thank you for joining me on this episode of Spolitics. I appreciate your continued support. You're a dear friend of mine. You know how I feel about you on a personal level. So for you to allow me this time with you is really magnificent, because I know you do not do this often. Imagine, and this is actually not as ironic as people would think it is, but despite the fact you often are the center of attention, you actually don't want to be the center of attention. And from that, in addition to us being, I think your birthday is December 16th. Is that correct?
That's
yes,
correct.
Mine is the 21st. In addition to us being born in the same month, just 5 days sort of apart, we share that same sort of weird idiosyncrasy. It's like center of attention, but never wants to be the center of attention. So I value your time and the fact that you chose to do this.
I will tell you again, as I've told you before, that beyond admiring you, I genuinely love you. You are a person that I think is very special in a lot of different ways, and to the degree that your audience would want what it is that we're doing. You and I are kindred spirits. We have, I'm going to say, similar paths. They're not that much different.
No, they're pretty similar, very similar.
Professionally, I would tell your audience, if they're interested in what we do, whether it's on YouTube or Max or now Peacock or Sirius XM, or you can get it wherever you get your podcast, how would you explain, if I were to ask you to promote what we do for your audience, how would you explain what our show is for people who would want a taste of something different?
Well, I would, honestly, I think your show is a culture show. I mean, because, again, I think you probably have the sort of unearned and earned reputation of being like a super serious guy who's always talking about race. But I think probably the thing people miss about you is like just how funny you are and how funny the entire sort of universe that you have built around yourself. So I would I know it says obviously Dan Le Batard and Friends, but this is like the Dan Le Batard universe. And much like how it was at ESPN, it's a universe that through the joy and the fun and even laughing at sports in the way that you do makes it an attractive product to me. Like as much as I enjoy your interviews, your thoughtfulness, your critique of our business, your critique of sports in general, I enjoy the fun just as much, if not more. So I would honestly put it in the basket of being a show about culture, about the culture of not just sports, but the culture of everything else that is on the fringes of sports. So, I mean, that's sort of my sort of 2-minute spiel about it.
For those who do not know, Jemele Hill has been a trusted advisor to Meadowlark Media since it began, and I am deeply appreciative that you lend any of your credibility to our silly project. So thank you for having me here, and thank you for being like one of the best guests we've had for a really long time in our universe.
All right, Dan, thank you so much for joining me, man.